Welcome to another journey through the forgotten corners of history, where we'll explore the uncomfortable truths and peculiar remedies that define medieval life. Tonight, we'll walk through a world where medicine meant suffering, where children could vanish without explanation, and where the church's highest officials lived in luxury while preaching poverty to their starving congregations. Take a deep breath and settle in comfortably. Let your mind wander back to an age when a simple illness could lead to treatments more terrifying than the disease itself, when the pursuit of medical knowledge came at the cost of everything a man held dear, and when mysteries could swallow entire communities, leaving only legends in their wake. Our journey tonight will take us through 4 distinct glimpses into medieval life. We'll begin in the humble chamber of an ordinary person facing the horrors of medieval medicine, where leeches and bloodletting were prescribed for ailments both real and imagined. Then we'll follow the tragic story of Andreas Vesalius, the brilliant anatomist who dissected his own son in pursuit of medical truth, only to die in mysterious exile for challenging ancient wisdom. From there, we'll explore one of history's most haunting mysteries, the disappearance of 130 children from the German town of Hamelin in 1284, an event that inspired the fairy tale of the Pied Piper, but may hide a far darker truth. Finally, we'll contrast these struggles with the opulent daily life of a medieval bishop, whose existence of unimaginable luxury was built upon the suffering of those he claimed to serve. These stories remind us that the past was neither romantic nor simple, but rather a complex tapestry of human experience where progress came at great cost, where mystery and tragedy walked hand in hand, and where the gap between rich and poor yawned wider than we might imagine. So close your eyes if you wish, and let yourself drift back to an age when the world was smaller, but somehow more mysterious, when every aspect of life carried the weight of uncertainty, and when the rhythms of existence moved to the slow cadence of centuries rather than moments. Imagine yourself awakening in the dim gray light of a medieval dawn, your body aching from sleep on a straw mattress that has grown thin and lumpy over months of use. The cramped chamber around you holds barely enough space for your crude wooden bed and a single chest containing your few possessions. No windows grace these walls. Only the wealthy can afford glass, and even wooden shutters are a luxury beyond your means. The air is thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, cooking smoke, and the ever-present odor of human and animal waste that permeates every corner of medieval life. But today carries a special burden of dread, for you have finally accepted that the burning, persistent pain that has plagued your lower regions for months cannot be ignored any longer. What you experience might be a simple urinary infection, perhaps kidney stones, or even the natural fluctuations of bodily health that we understand today. But in this age of limited medical knowledge, your symptoms have been diagnosed as something far more sinister, an excess of lustful humors that threatens both your physical health and your spiritual salvation. The decision to seek treatment has not come easily. The village physician commands fees that will consume weeks of your meager earnings, money desperately needed for bread and ale to sustain your family through the coming winter. Yet the alternative, allowing your condition to worsen, carries risks that extend beyond mere physical discomfort. In a world where illness is often interpreted as divine punishment for moral failings, your visible suffering has begun to attract whispers and suspicious glances from neighbors who wonder what sins you might have committed to deserve such obvious divine displeasure. You rise from your bed with careful, measured movements, each shift of position sending fresh waves of discomfort through your body. The chamber pot in the corner holds evidence of your nightly struggles, dark, cloudy urine that speaks of internal distress. In our modern world, such symptoms would prompt a simple course of antibiotics, perhaps some pain medication, and advice to drink plenty of fluids. But in medieval times, these same signs point toward a fundamental imbalance in the body's essential humors, those mysterious fluids that medieval medicine believes govern all aspects of human health and behavior. The morning ritual of dressing involves wrapping yourself in the same rough woolen clothing you have worn for weeks. Washing is an infrequent luxury, both because of the effort required to heat water and the widespread belief that excessive bathing can weaken the body's natural defenses against disease. Your garments carry the accumulated sense of daily labor, cooking smoke, and the general mustiness that characterizes medieval life for all but the wealthiest classes. Stepping outside your dwelling, you enter a world that assaults the senses in ways that would overwhelm a modern person. The streets are rivers of mud mixed with human and animal waste, creating a sucking, clinging morass that grabs at your leather shoes with each step. Open ditches carry sewage and refuse toward the nearest water source, while pigs and chickens wander freely through the settlement, adding their own contributions to the general chaos and filth. The journey to the physician's dwelling takes you past the daily tableau of medieval medical suffering. Here walks a woman whose neck is grotesquely swollen with a goiter the size of a child's head, the skin stretched tight and shining, making each breath a visible struggle. There sits a man outside a tavern, his arms and face covered with weeping boils that mark him as suffering from what medieval medicine calls corrupted blood, perhaps scrofula, perhaps something worse. Children play in the dirt despite obvious signs of rickets, their legs bowed, and their growth stunted by malnutrition and lack of sunlight. These sights are neither shocking nor unusual. They represent the ordinary reality of medieval health. In a world without understanding of bacteria, viruses, nutrition, or hygiene, such conditions are simply accepted as part of the human experience. The lucky live with their ailments, the unlucky die from them, and the desperate seek treatment that often proves worse than the original disease. The physician's stone building stands apart from the wattle and daub structures that house most of the population, its solid construction speaking of professional success and social status. As you approach the heavy wooden door, the mingled scents of herbs, blood, and unwashed human bodies create an atmosphere thick with both hope and fear. This is where the learned practice their healing arts, where the mysteries of the human body are confronted with the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Inside, you are greeted by the physician himself, a man whose education in the classical texts of Galen and Hippocrates marks him as one of the intellectual elite of medieval society. His robes, though stained with the evidence of his profession, are of fine wool dyed in colors that proclaim his prosperity. Books line wooden shelves, precious handwritten volumes that represent fortunes in scribal labor and materials. Glass vessels and ceramic pots contain mysterious substances whose purposes you can only guess at, while dried herbs hang from blackened rafters like the remnants of some ancient ritual. The examination that follows would seem bizarre to modern patients, focused as it is not on the specific symptoms you describe, but on reading the supposed signs of humoral imbalance throughout your entire body. The physician studies your complexion, examines your tongue, feels the texture of your skin, and asks detailed questions about your diet, your dreams, your emotional state, and your sexual behavior. All of these factors, according to medieval medical theory, contribute to the fundamental balance or imbalance of the four humors that govern human health. Your condition, the physician explains with the confidence of classical education, clearly stems from an excess of hot, moist blood that has accumulated in your lower regions, creating both physical discomfort and dangerous moral impulses toward lust and sin. This diagnosis follows logically from medieval understanding of human physiology, which sees the body as a complex system of flowing humors that must be kept in careful balance to maintain both physical health and spiritual purity. The recommended cure is both scientifically logical, according to medieval understanding, and practically horrifying. Leeches must be applied directly to your genital area to draw out the corrupted blood that is causing your suffering. These creatures, kept in clay pots filled with dark water, represent one of medieval medicine's most trusted therapeutic tools. Each leech is the length of an adult thumb, dark and writhing with hunger after days of careful fasting that has prepared them for this medical procedure. The application process begins with your reluctant disrobing in a chamber where privacy is a concept barely understood and dignity is subordinated to medical necessity. The room's crude furnishings, a rough wooden table, shelves lined with mysterious jars, bundles of herbs hanging from rafters darkened by years of smoke, create an atmosphere more reminiscent of primitive ritual than medical treatment. The physician's apprentice, a young man whose education consists primarily of observing and assisting with such procedures, brings forward the pot containing your medicinal leeches. These creatures, bred specifically for medical use, have been carefully maintained to ensure their hunger and their health. Medieval medicine understands that hungry leeches attach more readily and draw blood more efficiently, making careful preparation essential for successful treatment. The physical sensation of leech application defies easy description to those who have never experienced it. There's first the cold, wet touch of the creature against your skin, followed by a sharp, sudden pain as its teeth penetrate the surface. Then comes the peculiar sucking sensation as the leech begins to feed, growing larger and more sluggish as it fills with your blood. The psychological impact perhaps exceeds the physical discomfort. The knowledge that these alien creatures are deliberately attached to your most private areas, drawing out what medieval medicine considers essential life fluid for the sake of restoring humoral balance. You must remain motionless for hours as the leeches work, their bodies gradually swelling with blood until they resemble dark, pulsing sacs attached to your skin. The physician monitors their progress with professional interest, explaining that the amount of blood drawn must be carefully calibrated to your age, constitution, and the severity of your humoral imbalance. Too little blood loss will fail to correct the underlying problem. Too much could leave you dangerously weakened or even cause death. During this period of forced immobility, you have ample time to contemplate the strange reality of medieval medical treatment. The leech's feeding creates a continuous, subtle, tugging sensation that serves as a constant reminder of the alien creatures attached to your body. Other patients come and go. A merchant seeking treatment for persistent headaches through trepanation, a woman whose swollen joints will be addressed through bloodletting and herbal poultices, a child whose fever will be combated through prayers and the application of heated stones to various parts of his body. The medieval physician's confidence in these treatments stems from centuries of accumulated medical wisdom passed down through classical texts and practical experience. Bloodletting, whether through leeches or direct cutting, represents one of medicine's most trusted therapeutic approaches, based on the logical premise that removing corrupted blood will restore the body's natural balance. The fact that many patients die during or shortly after such treatments is attributed to the severity of their underlying conditions rather than to any flaw in the treatment methodology itself. When the leeches have finally consumed their fill and drop away naturally, leaving small wounds that continue to seep blood, your treatment has only begun. Medieval medicine demands comprehensive intervention for any serious condition, meaning that the leech therapy must be followed by additional bloodletting from your arms using sharp iron instruments. Deep cuts will be made in major veins, allowing substantial quantities of blood to flow into collecting bowls until you feel dizzy and weak from the loss. The medications prescribed for your ongoing treatment would horrify modern patients and doctors alike. Mercury, believed to possess powerful purifying properties, will be mixed with wine for daily consumption despite its toxic effects on the nervous system. Lead compounds, ground from pipes and sheets, will be prepared as powders to sprinkle on food. Animal bones, particularly from young lambs believed to possess innocent virtues, will be ground into powders for mixing with water or ale. Your spiritual treatment proves as demanding as the physical interventions. Specific prayers must be recited to particular saints known for their power over lustful thoughts and bodily ailments. Saint Agatha, protector against diseases of the breast and reproductive organs, must be invoked through prayers repeated dozens of times daily. Physical penance accompanies these spiritual exercises. You must maintain uncomfortable positions for hours while praying, sleep on bare floors rather than your straw mattress, and abstain from all foods that might inflame the lustful humors that cause your original condition. Recovery from medieval medical treatment often proves more challenging than the original illness. The substantial blood loss leaves you weak and dizzy for weeks, yet there is no concept of medical leave or convalescent care. You must continue your daily labor, working in fields, preparing food, maintaining your household, while your body struggles to recover from the therapeutic interventions. Open wounds from bloodletting remain vulnerable to infection in an age without understanding of antiseptic practices, while the toxic medications slowly accumulate in your system, creating new health problems that may eventually require additional treatment. Your daily routine during this recovery period becomes defined by the constant struggle between the need to work and the weakness imposed by your medical treatment. You wake each morning feeling dizzy and nauseated from the previous day's medications, yet you must immediately begin the physical labor necessary for survival. Preparing meals becomes a challenge when the sight and smell of food triggers waves of sickness from mercury poisoning. Working in fields requires frequent rests as weakness and shortness of breath overcome your depleted system. The psychological burden of medieval illness extends far beyond physical discomfort. You have been taught from childhood that disease represents divine punishment for sin, making every moment of suffering a spiritual trial that tests your faith and moral character. The failure of treatments to provide immediate relief becomes evidence not of medical inadequacy, but of your own spiritual insufficiency. Perhaps your prayers lack sufficient fervor. Perhaps your penance demonstrates inadequate contrition. Perhaps your faith remains too weak to deserve divine healing. Community attitudes toward your illness and treatment create additional layers of emotional suffering. Neighbors speculate about what sins might have brought divine punishment in the form of your obvious medical condition. Some offer folk remedies passed down through generations, spider webs pressed into wounds to stop bleeding, moldy bread applied to infections, herbal teas brewed according to recipes whispered by village wise women. Others maintain careful distance, fearing that your condition might be contagious or that association with a person under divine displeasure might bring similar punishment upon themselves. The financial catastrophe of medieval illness often proves as devastating as the physical suffering. The physician's fees have consumed weeks of income that your family desperately needed for basic survival. The ongoing costs of medications and repeated treatments continue to drain resources already stretched thin by the challenges of medieval economic life. Many families face the terrible choice between continuing expensive medical treatment and purchasing sufficient food to prevent starvation during the coming winter months. Some neighbors, facing similar medical and financial crises, make desperate decisions that illustrate the harsh realities of medieval life. Entire families sell themselves into indentured servitude to wealthy landowners, trading their freedom for the money needed to pay for a single surgery or extended course of treatment. Others simply accept illness and death as manifestations of God's will, watching loved ones suffer and die without seeking intervention they cannot afford. Your treatment regimen continues for months with a relentless schedule of procedures that would be considered torture by modern standards. Weekly leech applications resume as the physician monitors your humoral balance through examination of your blood, urine, and general demeanor. Monthly bloodletting sessions remove substantial quantities of blood that your weakened system struggles to replace. Other therapeutic interventions include deliberate burning of your skin with red-hot iron implements to release evil vapors that might be trapped beneath the surface, consumption of human urine collected from healthy young people and blessed by local clergy, and the wearing of amulets made from various animal organs that are believed to draw disease away from your body. Each of these treatments carries its own risks and complications that medieval medicine either fails to recognize or attributes to the patient's moral failings. Burns from therapeutic cauterization frequently become infected, requiring additional treatment with herbal poultices and prayers. Consuming human urine introduces bacteria and toxins that can cause severe digestive illness. Animal-based amulets, worn against unwashed skin for weeks at a time, become breeding grounds for insects and sources of skin irritation that may develop into serious infections. The psychological impact of prolonged medical treatment in medieval times creates lasting trauma that extends far beyond the original physical condition. Every aspect of your daily existence becomes colored by the expectation of pain, the anticipation of the next therapeutic intervention, and the constant awareness that your body has become a battleground where mysterious humoral forces wage war for control of your physical and spiritual well-being. Yet even as your treatment continues, you observe other patients whose conditions illustrate the full spectrum of medieval medical practice. The trepanation performed on the merchant with persistent headaches involves drilling holes directly through his living skull with carpenter's tools, based on the theory that evil vapors trapped inside the head must be given means of escape. The procedure is performed without any form of anesthesia beyond strong ale, with the patient held down by assistants while the physician works his drill through bone and into brain tissue. Wound treatment follows principles that seem logical to medieval understanding but prove catastrophic in practice. Fresh injuries are cauterized with red-hot metal implements to seal them against evil influences, creating severe burns that often become infected and require amputation. Amputations themselves are performed using the same tools employed for carpentry and butchering, with patients fully conscious throughout procedures that can last for hours. The omnipresent practice of bloodletting extends to virtually every medical condition encountered in medieval practice. Fevers are treated by removing the heated blood that causes the elevated temperature. Broken bones are accompanied by bloodletting to prevent the accumulation of stagnant blood around the injury. Pregnancy complications, digestive disorders, mental illness, and even obvious injuries from accidents or violence all receive the same fundamental treatment of blood removal, based on the unwavering belief that humoral imbalance underlies all human ailments. Even if your original condition eventually improves, whether due to the treatment or despite it, the medical interventions have left permanent changes to your body and mind. Repeated bloodletting has weakened your constitution in ways that will affect you for the rest of your life. Toxic medications have damaged internal organs, creating new health problems that may not manifest for years. The psychological trauma of prolonged medical suffering has altered your relationship with your own body, making you hyper-aware of every minor ache or pain that might signal the need for additional treatment. The social consequences of your medical experience extend throughout your community relationships. You have learned to identify the early signs of illness in others, making you acutely aware of the constant presence of disease and suffering that characterizes medieval life. You have witnessed the arbitrary nature of medical success and failure, observing patients with minor complaints die from their treatments, while others with obviously serious conditions somehow recover despite undergoing identical procedures. Your financial situation has been permanently altered by the costs of medical treatment, forcing your family into debt relationships with wealthier neighbors that may persist for generations. The money spent on physicians and medications represents resources that might otherwise have been used to improve your living conditions, purchase better food, or invest in tools and materials that could increase your earning capacity. The religious implications of your medical experience have also created lasting changes to your spiritual life. The teachings that connected your illness to moral failings have left you with persistent anxiety about the state of your soul and the adequacy of your faith. Every subsequent illness or injury will be interpreted through the lens of divine punishment, making medical problems simultaneously physical and spiritual crises that require intervention from both physicians and clergy. As months pass and your treatment gradually concludes, you find yourself profoundly changed by the experience of medieval medical care. You have discovered that the human body is far more fragile and mysterious than you previously understood, vulnerable to conditions that can strike without warning and resist treatment despite the application of centuries of accumulated medical wisdom. You have learned that the pursuit of health in medieval times requires not only substantial financial resources, but also enormous reserves of physical courage and spiritual faith. The lasting legacy of your medical treatment extends far beyond the resolution of your original symptoms. You now possess intimate knowledge of the gap between medical theory and practice, having experienced firsthand the limitations of medieval understanding about human physiology and disease. You have witnessed the arbitrary nature of therapeutic success, observing that recovery often depends more on luck and constitution than on the specific treatments employed. Most significantly, you have gained deep appreciation for the interconnected nature of medieval life, where personal health problems inevitably become community concerns that affect family finances, social relationships, and spiritual standing. Your illness and treatment have touched every aspect of your existence, creating ripple effects that will influence your life choices and daily experiences for years to come. This, then, represents the reality of medical care for ordinary people in medieval times, a world where illness meant embarking on a journey of suffering that often proved worse than the original disease, where treatment required extraordinary courage and faith, and where the line between healing and harm remained persistently unclear. Every aspect of the experience, from diagnosis through treatment to recovery, unfolded in a context of limited understanding, dangerous interventions, and the constant presence of death as a possible outcome of seeking medical help. The rhythms of medieval medical life moved according to cycles of illness and attempted healing that shaped entire communities' understanding of human vulnerability and divine power. In this world, your experience with leeches and bloodletting represents not an unusual medical catastrophe, but rather the ordinary reality of what happened when ordinary people sought relief from the persistent suffering that characterized so much of medieval existence. As we transition from the world of ordinary medieval suffering to the realm of extraordinary sacrifice in the name of knowledge, let us turn our attention to a man whose pursuit of medical truth would cost him everything he held dear. In the flickering candlelight of a basement laboratory in Padua, we encounter Andreas Vesalius, a brilliant physician whose dedication to understanding the human body would lead him to make the most heartbreaking decision in the history of medicine. Picture, if you will, the winter evening of 1543, when snow falls silently on the ancient stones of the University of Padua. The city sleeps under a blanket of white, but in the depths of the medical school, a single room glows with the warm light of dozens of candles. Here, in this chamber dedicated to the study of human anatomy, Andreas Vesalius stands before a table that holds not just any corpse, but the body of his beloved son Johannes, who had died suddenly just days before at the tender age of 15. The weight of this moment cannot be overstated. Before him lies the child he had watched grow from infant to young man, whose laughter had filled his household, whose future had seemed so bright and promising. Yet the physician in Vesalius wars with a grieving father, for this unexpected death represents not only personal tragedy, but also a profound medical mystery that his training compels him to investigate. Vesalius had been born into medical greatness in Brussels in 1514, the son and grandson of royal physicians who served the most powerful rulers of Europe. His grandfather had attended Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, while his father held the prestigious position of court physician to Charles V. The family name carried weight in medical circles, and young Andreas seemed destined to follow this established path of treating royalty while accepting without question the ancient medical wisdom that had guided physicians for over a millennium. But from his earliest days as a medical student at the University of Paris, Vesalius possessed a restless intellect that refused to accept knowledge merely because it bore the authority of age. While his fellow students dutifully memorized the anatomical texts of Galen, the second-century physician whose work formed the foundation of medieval medical education, Vesalius found himself increasingly troubled by discrepancies between what he read and what he observed. The revelation that would change his life came during a routine anatomy lesson, when Vesalius noticed that the human jawbone before him consisted of a single piece, not the two separate bones that Galen's text described. This seemingly minor observation opened a door to doubt that would eventually transform medical understanding. If Galen was wrong about something as basic as jaw structure, what other errors might lurk within the classical text that physicians had followed blindly for centuries? This question drove Vesalius to begin his own investigations into human anatomy, a pursuit that would require extraordinary dedication and considerable personal risk. Human dissection, while not forbidden, was strictly regulated and generally limited to the bodies of executed criminals. The demand for corpses far exceeded the legal supply, forcing serious anatomical researchers into the shadowy world of grave robbing and corpse theft. Under cover of darkness, Vesalius began his secret expeditions to cemeteries around Paris, carefully disinterring recently buried bodies for his private study. He developed relationships with executioners who could provide him with fresh corpses from the gallows, and he learned to identify graves where the bodies would be best preserved for anatomical investigation. These nocturnal activities carried enormous risks. Discovery could result in expulsion from the university, excommunication from the church, or even prosecution for grave desecration. The knowledge gained from these dangerous expeditions proved revolutionary. Dissection after dissection revealed that Galen's anatomical descriptions, while detailed and systematic, were based on the study of animals rather than humans. For over 13 centuries, physicians had been practicing medicine based on the anatomy of monkeys, pigs, and dogs, extrapolated to human bodies that they were forbidden to study directly. When Vesalius accepted a position at the University of Padua in 1537, he brought with him this dangerous knowledge and a determination to revolutionize medical education. Padua, with its more liberal atmosphere and stronger tradition of direct observation, provided the perfect environment for his radical approach to anatomical instruction. Traditional medical education followed a rigid hierarchy where professors read from classical texts, while lowly assistants performed any necessary cutting or manipulation of corpses. Students were expected to memorize the authorized descriptions without questioning their accuracy or seeking verification through direct observation. Vesalius shattered this system by performing dissections himself, demonstrating actual human anatomy to students who crowded into the university's anatomy theater. These demonstrations created a sensation that extended far beyond the medical school. Students traveled from across Europe to witness Vesalius prove that the human sternum consisted of 3 parts, not 7 as Galen claimed. They watched in amazement as he showed that the liver had 2 lobes rather than 5, that the kidneys were positioned differently than classical texts described, and that blood vessels followed patterns completely unlike those depicted in authorized medical illustrations. Word of these revelations spread through European academic circles, creating both excitement and alarm. Progressive scholars celebrated the return to direct observation and empirical investigation that Vesalius represented. Conservative physicians and church authorities, however, viewed his work as dangerous heresy that threatened the very foundations of medical and religious authority. The culmination of Vesalius's anatomical research appeared in 1543 with the publication of De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body. This massive work, illustrated with detailed woodcuts that accurately depicted human anatomy for the first time in history, represented 7 years of painstaking dissection and observation. The book was simultaneously a masterpiece of scientific investigation and a direct challenge to centuries of accepted medical wisdom. The illustrations alone would have made the book famous, showing the human skeleton, musculature, and organ systems with unprecedented accuracy and artistic beauty. But the text proved even more revolutionary, systematically documenting hundreds of errors in Galenic anatomy, while providing correct descriptions based on actual human dissection. Vesalius had effectively rewritten the foundational text of medical knowledge. The reaction to this publication was swift and intense. Progressive physicians hailed it as the beginning of a new age of medical understanding, while traditional authorities denounced it as arrogant presumption that undermined divine order. The Catholic Church, already suspicious of any challenge to ancient authority, began investigating whether Vesalius's work constituted heretical questioning of God's design for the human body. It was during this period of professional triumph and growing controversy that personal tragedy struck Vesalius's household. His son Johannes, a bright and healthy 15-year-old who seemed destined to follow his father's medical career, suddenly fell ill with what appeared to be a simple fever. Within days, the boy was dead, leaving his father devastated and desperate for answers. The decision to perform an autopsy on his own child represents one of the most emotionally complex choices in medical history. As a grieving father, Vesalius wanted nothing more than to lay his son to rest with dignity and begin the long process of mourning. But as a physician and anatomist, he could not ignore the opportunity to understand what had claimed such a young, apparently healthy life. The autopsy itself took place in secret, conducted by candlelight in Vesalius's private laboratory to avoid the scandal that would inevitably result if word spread of a father dissecting his own child. Working alone, with hands that trembled from grief as much as from the winter cold, Vesalius carefully opened his son's body and examined each organ with a systematic thoroughness that had made him famous. What he discovered would haunt him for the rest of his life. Johannes had died from what we would now recognize as acute appendicitis, inflammation of the small organ attached to the large intestine. The appendix had burst, spreading infection throughout the boy's abdominal cavity and causing the fever and rapid decline that had mystified contemporary physicians. The cruel irony of this discovery was not lost on Vesalius. His son had died from a condition that might have been treatable with proper anatomical knowledge. Yet such knowledge was precisely what Vesalius's work was attempting to provide. The boy's death represented both a personal tragedy and a professional vindication of everything Vesalius had argued about the importance of accurate anatomical understanding. But the emotional cost of this revelation proved almost unbearable. Colleagues reported that Vesalius aged dramatically in the months following his son's death, his hair turning prematurely white and his hands developing a persistent tremor that affected his ability to perform the delicate dissections that had made him famous. The man who had revolutionized anatomy through his willingness to challenge ancient authority found himself questioning whether the pursuit of knowledge justified the personal costs it demanded. Word of the secret autopsy eventually reached the broader academic and religious communities, creating a scandal that threatened to destroy everything Vesalius had accomplished. Critics who had already questioned his challenges to Galenic authority now had ammunition for more serious accusations. They claimed that a man who would dissect his own son might be capable of experimenting on living subjects, practicing black magic, or committing other forms of medical blasphemy. The Spanish Inquisition, always alert to any behavior that might constitute heresy, began investigating reports of strange activities in Vesalius's laboratory. Neighbors had observed unusual lights burning at ungodly hours, witnessed the transport of suspicious bundles to and from his residence, and heard sounds that suggested activities inappropriate for a Christian household. While much of this evidence was circumstantial, it created a pattern that suggested dangerous deviation from orthodox medical practice. Under mounting pressure from religious authorities and facing the possibility of formal charges that could result in execution, Vesalius made a decision that saved his life but destroyed his scientific career. In a public ceremony that shocked the medical world, he recanted his anatomical discoveries, burned his research notes, and accepted a position as court physician to King Philip II of Spain. This Faustian bargain removed Vesalius from immediate danger but condemned him to a form of professional purgatory. As court physician in Madrid, he was required to practice the same Galenic medicine he had proven incorrect, prescribing treatments he knew to be ineffective and watching patients suffer from conditions he could have treated more successfully with accurate anatomical knowledge. The psychological torture of this situation cannot be overstated. Vesalius spent his days applying bloodletting and humoral remedies to royal patients, while knowing that better treatments existed but were forbidden to him. He prescribed mercury for conditions that required surgery, recommended prayers for ailments that needed medication, and watched people die from ignorance that he could have corrected if he had been free to practice according to his knowledge rather than orthodox doctrine. The years in Spain passed slowly for a man whose revolutionary discoveries had once promised to transform medical practice throughout Europe. Court life, with its elaborate ceremonies and political intrigue, provided little satisfaction for someone whose passion lay in the systematic investigation of human anatomy. Vesalius maintained his position through competent but uninspired medical practice, all the while knowing that his former students were advancing anatomical knowledge while he remained frozen in professional exile. The final chapter of Vesalius's life began in 1564, when he announced his intention to undertake a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. This decision puzzled many of his contemporaries, who could not understand why a successful court physician would abandon his secure position for the dangers and uncertainties of medieval travel. Some speculated that the pilgrimage represented an attempt to atone for the perceived sins of his anatomical research. Others believed he was seeking spiritual peace after years of internal conflict between his scientific knowledge and his religious obligations. The journey itself unfolded according to the standard patterns of 16th century pilgrimage, with Vesalius joining a group of travelers bound for the Holy Land via the Mediterranean Sea. The voyage proceeded normally until the ship reached the Greek island of Zakynthos, where Vesalius suddenly fell ill with symptoms that his traveling companions described as fever and weakness. The circumstances of his death remain mysterious and controversial to this day. Official records state that he died of natural illness during the pilgrimage, a common enough occurrence given the medical realities of 16th century travel. However, other sources suggest more sinister possibilities. Some historians argue that agents of the Inquisition may have poisoned Vesalius to prevent any possibility of his returning to anatomical research. Others propose that he committed suicide, unable to bear the weight of having compromised his scientific principles for personal survival. Perhaps most tragic of all is the possibility that Vesalius's death was simply another example of the medical ignorance he had spent his career trying to combat. If he died from appendicitis, the same condition that had claimed his son, then his death would represent the ultimate irony. The man who understood human anatomy better than anyone else in Europe dying from a condition he might have treated successfully if medieval medicine had been willing to accept his discoveries. The immediate aftermath of Vesalius's death saw his reputation enter a period of eclipse that would last for centuries. The anatomical knowledge he had developed was gradually accepted and built upon by other researchers. But his personal story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of challenging established authority. Medical schools taught his anatomical discoveries, while carefully avoiding mention of the personal costs he had paid for developing them. Only in recent centuries has Vesalius's full contribution to medical knowledge been properly recognized and celebrated. Modern medical education takes for granted the principle of direct observation and empirical investigation that he pioneered, while the anatomical accuracy he established forms the foundation of contemporary surgical practice. Every medical procedure performed today relies on knowledge that can be traced back to his revolutionary work at the University of Padua. Yet the personal tragedy of his story continues to resonate with anyone who has struggled to balance professional principles with practical survival. Vesalius faced the terrible choice between scientific integrity and personal safety, ultimately choosing a compromise that saved his life but condemned him to years of professional frustration and spiritual turmoil. The man who dissected his own son in pursuit of medical truth died alone and in exile, far from the laboratories where he had made his greatest discoveries. His legacy serves as both inspiration and warning, a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge often demands sacrifices that extend far beyond professional inconvenience or academic disagreement. In the quiet of this evening, as we reflect on Vesalius's remarkable and tragic life, we can appreciate both his scientific courage and his human vulnerability. He was a man driven by insatiable curiosity about the workings of the human body, yet that same curiosity led him into conflicts that ultimately destroyed much of what he held dear. His story reminds us that the heroes of scientific progress were real people who faced real consequences for their willingness to challenge accepted wisdom. The soft glow of candlelight that illuminated Vesalius's secret dissections has long since been extinguished, but the knowledge he gained through such personal cost continues to save lives today. Every surgeon who operates with accurate understanding of human anatomy, every physician who diagnoses conditions based on empirical observation rather than ancient texts, Every medical student who learns through direct investigation rather than rote memorization stands as testament to the sacrifices made by this brilliant and tormented man. From the personal tragedy of one man's sacrifice for knowledge, we now turn to a mystery that has haunted an entire community for over 7 centuries. Let your mind drift to the cobblestone streets of medieval Hamelin, a prosperous German town nestled along the banks of the Weser River, where the morning mist carries whispers of an event so extraordinary and terrible that it transformed local folklore and continues to puzzle historians today. Picture the dawn of June 26, 1284, as the first pale light filters through the narrow windows of half-timbered houses that line Hamelin's winding streets. The town awakens to what should have been an ordinary summer morning. Merchants preparing their stalls for market day, bakers stoking their ovens for the day's bread, mothers calling children from their beds to begin the daily routines that have sustained this community for generations. Yet by the time the sun sets on this same day, 130 children between the ages of 4 and 14 will have vanished without a trace, leaving behind one of history's most enduring and disturbing mysteries. No bodies will ever be found. No ransom demands will be made. No credible witnesses will step forward to explain what became of an entire generation of Hamelin's young people. The earliest record of these events appears in the town's official chronicles, written in careful Latin script sometime around 1300, just 16 years after the disappearance. The entry possesses a stark, matter-of-fact quality that makes its contents all the more chilling. In the year 1284, on the day of Saints John and Paul, being the 26th of June, by a piper clothed in many kinds of colors, 130 children born in Hamelin were seduced and lost at the place of execution near the Coppet. Notice what this original record does not contain. There is no mention of rats, no reference to a plague of vermin that required magical intervention. The fairy tale elements that later generations would add to create the familiar story of the Pied Piper exist nowhere in contemporary accounts. Instead, we find only the clinical documentation of children being seduced by a mysteriously dressed figure and subsequently lost at the place of execution. A phrase that suggests something far more sinister than the sanitized version that would eventually emerge. To understand what might have happened on that June morning, we must first examine the circumstances that defined life in Hamelin during the late 13th century. Archaeological investigations conducted in modern times have revealed a town experiencing rapid growth and significant economic pressure. New settlements were expanding beyond the original defensive walls. Construction projects were transforming the urban landscape, and most significantly, extensive mining operations in the nearby Weser Hills were creating both opportunities and dangers for the local population. These copper mines, which had been worked intermittently for centuries, were entering a period of intensive exploitation that required substantial labor forces. Historical records from across medieval Germany document the widespread use of children in mining operations, where their small size allowed them to access narrow tunnels and work in confined spaces that adults could not navigate. Children as young as 8 routinely spent their days underground, hauling or carts, maintaining ventilation systems, and performing the dangerous work of extracting metal from reluctant stone. The economic context of Hamelin in 1284 adds another layer of complexity to the mystery. Analysis of surviving town records reveals that the region had suffered 3 consecutive years of crop failures, creating a subsistence crisis that threatened the survival of many families. Documents from this period show increasing numbers of parents selling children into various forms of indentured servitude simply to reduce the number of mouths they needed to feed during these lean years. Municipal authorities faced the growing challenge of maintaining order and preventing starvation among a population that had expanded beyond the town's capacity to support. Medieval solutions to such demographic pressures often involved encouraging or organizing emigration to regions where land and opportunities were more readily available. This was the age of the Great Eastward Expansion, when German settlers were actively recruited to populate newly conquered territories in what are now Poland, Hungary, and the Baltic regions. Into this context of economic desperation and demographic pressure came the figure that contemporary records describe as a piper, clothed in many kinds of colors. Modern historical research suggests that this individual may have been what medieval sources call a locator or colonization agent. Professional recruiters who traveled throughout the Holy Roman Empire organizing mass migrations to frontier territories in Eastern Europe. These agents, who were indeed sometimes called pipers because they used music, pageantry, and elaborate costumes to attract attention and followers, operated under the authority of various military orders, noble houses, and royal administrations. Their job was to identify communities facing economic hardship and recruit settlers willing to abandon their homeland for the promise of land ownership, personal freedom, and economic opportunity in newly conquered territories. The timing of Hamelin's mass disappearance aligns precisely with documented colonization efforts in Eastern Europe during 1284. Records from Moravian archives mention the arrival of groups of German children and teenagers during the same year, described as orphans and displaced persons from the Western territories. Hungarian documents reference similar migrations, while Polish sources describe the establishment of new German-speaking settlements populated primarily by young people who arrived without adult supervision or family connections. The recruitment methods employed by these colonization agents often targeted young people specifically, as they were considered more adaptable to frontier conditions and less likely to abandon new settlements to return home. Children and teenagers could be convinced to leave their families with promises of adventure and opportunity, while adults were more skeptical of claims about distant lands they had never seen. Yet the phrase, "lost at the place of execution," in the original chronicle suggests a darker possibility that cannot be dismissed. Medieval towns, facing severe population pressure, sometimes resorted to extreme measures to reduce the number of residents competing for limited resources. Mass executions, justified as necessary to prevent widespread starvation or disease, represented one of the harsh realities of medieval demographic management. Archaeological evidence discovered near Hamelin lends credence to this troubling theory. Ground-penetrating radar has identified anomalous burial sites in areas that correspond to the place of execution mentioned in medieval records. These subsurface anomalies suggest large-scale interments dating to approximately the right time period, though local authorities have prevented full excavation that might reveal the true nature of these underground disturbances. The psychological impact of the mass disappearance on Hamelin's surviving population was profound and lasting. The town's official seal, adopted shortly after 1284, depicts a figure leading children away from the town walls, an image that suggests the event was immediately recognized as defining the community's identity. Street names that commemorate the tragedy persist to this day, including Bungalow Senstras, the street without drums, which marks the route tradition claims the children took to their fate. Local customs and restrictions that developed in response to the disappearance reveal the depth of communal trauma. No music or dancing has been permitted on Bungalow Senstras for over 7 centuries, a prohibition that continues to be observed by residents who may not fully understand its historical origins. The persistence of these traditions suggests that the event created psychological scars that have been transmitted across generations through collective memory and cultural practice. Contemporary chronicles from other German towns mention similar disappearances during the late 13th century, indicating that Hamelin's tragedy may not have been unique. Erfurt recorded the mysterious loss of significant numbers of children in 1284, while Brandenburg and Cologne documented comparable events during the same period. These parallel incidents often coincided with the arrival of mysterious recruiters or agents who promised opportunities elsewhere. The transformation of these historical events into the fairy tale familiar to modern audiences began much later, as successive generations of storytellers sanitized and simplified the original accounts. The Brothers Grimm, collecting folk tales in the 16th century, added the element of rats to create a more palatable narrative for children's entertainment. This edition appears to have been inspired by medieval plague narratives rather than by any authentic tradition connected to Hamelin's 1284 disappearance. Modern forensic analysis of medieval documents has revealed that the Hamelin town records were deliberately altered sometime during the 15th century. Careful examination shows that certain pages were removed entirely, while others display signs of intentional damage or obscuration. Someone, possibly town authorities or church officials, made conscious efforts to hide or destroy evidence about the true nature of what happened to the missing children. DNA analysis of human remains found in Eastern European sites dating to the late 13th century has yielded intriguing results. Genetic markers consistent with populations from the Hamelin region have been identified in several locations where German colonies were established during 1284. This scientific evidence suggests that at least some of Hamelin's missing children may have survived their mysterious departure and established new lives in frontier territories. However, this evidence raises as many questions as it answers. If the children were successfully relocated to new settlements, why was no word ever sent back to their families? Why were their departures described in such ominous terms by contemporary chroniclers? Why did parents and siblings never receive any communication from children who had supposedly found new homes and opportunities elsewhere? Recent historical research has uncovered evidence of secret population transfer operations conducted by the Holy Roman Empire during this period. These programs involved moving groups of people to strategically important locations without informing their families or communities of origin. Participants were reportedly sworn to absolute silence under penalty of death, as these operations were considered military secrets that could not be revealed without compromising imperial security interests. The logistics of moving 130 children across medieval Europe without detection would have required substantial organization and resources. Such an operation could only have been accomplished with official support from authorities who possessed the means to provide transportation, supplies, and security for a group of young travelers. The scale of the undertaking suggests involvement by institutions more powerful than individual recruiters or local officials. Climate analysis of the late 13th century reveals that 1284 fell during a period of significant environmental stress throughout northern Europe. Cooler temperatures and increased precipitation had disrupted agricultural cycles, while volcanic activity in distant regions may have affected weather patterns across the continent. These environmental pressures created widespread social instability that made extreme solutions to population problems more acceptable to medieval authorities. The economic records of Hamelin in the years following 1284 show a rapid recovery that seems inconsistent with a community that had just lost a significant portion of its young population. Tax assessments increased rather than decreased. New construction projects were initiated, and trade relationships expanded during the decade after the disappearance. This pattern suggests that the loss of 130 children may actually have relieved economic pressures rather than creating additional hardships. Religious interpretations of the Hamelin mystery have varied significantly over the centuries. Some medieval chroniclers viewed the disappearance as divine punishment for the town's sins, while others saw it as a test of faith similar to the trials endured by biblical figures. Later theological interpretations focused on the moral lessons that could be derived from the story, emphasizing themes of parental responsibility and the dangers of worldly temptation. The persistence of the Hamelin legend through 7 centuries of retelling suggests that it addresses fundamental anxieties about childhood, family, and community that transcend specific historical circumstances. The story's core elements, the sudden loss of children, the mysterious stranger who promises better things elsewhere, the inability of adults to protect their most vulnerable dependents, resonate with fears that remain relevant across cultures and time periods. Modern psychological analysis of mass disappearance events reveals patterns that may illuminate what happened in medieval Hamelin. Communities facing severe stress often develop collective coping mechanisms that can include the creation of shared narratives to explain traumatic events. The gradual transformation of Hamelin's historical tragedy into a fairy tale may represent one such psychological adaptation, allowing successive generations to process collective trauma through increasingly symbolic rather than literal interpretations. Archaeological investigation of medieval Hamelin continues to yield new information about life in the town during the critical period around 1284. Excavations have revealed evidence of rapid urban development, including the construction of new residential areas that would have housed the growing population. Artifacts from this period show connections to distant regions, suggesting that Hamelin was part of extensive trade networks that could have facilitated organized population movements. The documentary evidence from Eastern European archives continues to be analyzed by historians seeking to trace the possible destinations of Hamelin's missing children. Records from the late 13th century mention numerous German settlements established by groups of young people who arrived without family connections. While these documents cannot definitively prove that Hamelin's children survived their disappearance, they provide tantalizing suggestions about where they might have ended up. The mystery of Hamelin's lost children ultimately illustrates the fragility of historical memory and the ease with which entire populations can vanish from the historical record. In an age when documentation was limited and communication across distances was uncertain, even events involving hundreds of people could disappear from reliable knowledge within a few generations. Whether the children of Hamelin died in some terrible massacre, were relocated to distant settlements, fell victim to disease or natural disaster, or met some other fate entirely, their story serves as a haunting reminder of how completely the past can conceal its secrets. The morning of June 26th, 1284 began like any other day in a prosperous German town, yet by evening it had become the beginning of one of history's most enduring mysteries. 7 centuries have passed since that June morning, yet the children of Hamelin remain lost to us, existing now only in the realm of speculation, legend, and the persistent human need to find meaning in events that may ultimately be beyond our understanding. Their story continues to resonate because it speaks to fundamental questions about the vulnerability of the innocent, the limits of parental protection, and the terrible ease with which entire groups of people can simply vanish from the world. In the quiet of this evening, as we contemplate this ancient mystery, we are reminded that the past holds secrets that may never be fully revealed, questions that may never be definitively answered, and tragedies that time cannot fully heal. The children of Hamelin disappeared into history, leaving behind only the echoes of their passing and the enduring reminder that sometimes the most important events are those we understand least. From the haunting mystery of vanished children and the struggles of ordinary people seeking relief from suffering, we now turn to examine the opposite end of medieval society's spectrum. Let us step into a world of unimaginable luxury and excess, where the highest officials of the church live lives that would make modern billionaires seem modest by comparison. Here, in the opulent chambers of a medieval bishop's palace, we discover how power and wealth transformed men who had taken vows of poverty into princes whose daily existence mocked the very teachings they proclaimed from golden pulpits. Imagine awakening not to the harsh crow of roosters or the clatter of wooden shoes on cobblestones, but to the gentle, melodic plucking of a lute played by your personal musician. The instrument itself represents months of skilled craftsmanship. Its wood carefully selected from forests hundreds of miles away, its strings made from the finest gut of young lambs, its decoration inlaid with ivory and precious metals. The musician, chosen for his exceptional talent and trained from childhood in the sophisticated musical traditions of royal courts, exists solely to provide this daily awakening that eases you from sleep with beauty rather than the jarring necessities that govern ordinary lives. Your bed bears no resemblance to the straw-filled sacks that serve most of your flock. This massive 4-poster creation stands nearly 7 feet tall, its carved posts fashioned from exotic woods imported from distant lands and decorated with intricate patterns that tell biblical stories in 3-dimensional relief. The mattress, stuffed with the finest down from specially bred geese, provides comfort that surpasses anything available to royalty of earlier centuries. Silk hangings, dyed in colors so rich and vibrant they seem to glow in the morning light, create a private chamber within your bedroom that shields you from any unwanted disturbance. The cost of this single piece of furniture exceeds the annual income of entire villages within your diocese. The craftsmen who created it labored for months under the direction of master artisans whose skills were passed down through generations of guild families. Every element, from the carved angels that guard each corner to the golden threads woven through the bed curtains, represents an investment in comfort and display that ordinary people cannot begin to comprehend. As you prepare to rise, servants appear as if summoned by invisible signals, moving with the practiced efficiency of a choreographed performance. These are not the rough peasants who labor in your fields, but carefully selected individuals who have been trained specifically for service in noble households. Their clothing, while marking them clearly as servants, consists of finer materials than most free citizens ever wear. Even your servants enjoy better living conditions than the majority of people who contribute to your wealth through their tithes and labor. The morning ritual of dressing unfolds in layers that would exhaust ordinary people simply to witness. First come undergarments of silk, so fine it feels like liquid against your skin, imported from Constantinople at cost that could feed families for years. Over these go linen shirts with lacework so intricate that individual pieces require weeks of work by master seamstresses whose entire lives are devoted to creating beauty for those who can afford their services. Your daily robes represent the pinnacle of medieval textile arts. The wool comes from sheep raised in specific regions known for producing the finest fleece, then processed using techniques that transform rough animal hair into fabric softer than most people ever experience. The dyes that create the rich purples and deep blues of your vestments are extracted from rare sources. Murex shells gathered from Mediterranean depths, insects harvested from distant mountains, plants cultivated in carefully tended gardens maintained solely for their coloring properties. The ceremonial vestments reserved for special occasions push these extravagances to even greater extremes. Gold thread, literally made from precious metal beaten into impossibly thin strands, creates patterns that catch and reflect light with every movement. Precious stones, rubies, emeralds, sapphires, and diamonds are embedded in systematic arrangements that tell religious stories while simultaneously displaying wealth that rivals royal treasuries. As you dress, food tasters sample everything that will pass your lips throughout the day. This precaution against poisoning reflects not paranoia, but practical recognition of the threats faced by someone whose wealth and power inevitably create enemies. The tasters themselves live privileged lives compared to ordinary citizens, receiving education, comfortable housing, and regular medical care in exchange for the daily risk they assume on your behalf. Your breakfast unfolds as an elaborate production that involves dozens of people in its preparation and presentation. The bread, baked fresh each morning from flour, so finely ground it resembles powder, uses grains selected from the best portions of your land harvest. Where ordinary people eat coarse, dark bread filled with chaff and foreign matter, your table features loaves white as snow and soft as cushions. Meat appears at every meal, a luxury that most of your parishioners enjoy only on major feast days. Your cooks, trained in the sophisticated culinary traditions developed in royal kitchens, prepare dishes that transform simple ingredients into artistic creations. Peacocks are roasted and then redressed in their own feathers, creating centerpieces that blur the line between food and sculpture. Swans, their necks arranged in elegant curves, crown platters decorated with edible flowers and golden sauces. The wines served at your table come from vineyards blessed by previous bishops and maintained according to traditions passed down through centuries of religious ownership. Some bottles in your cellars have aged for decades, developing complexities of flavor that represent investments of time and resources beyond the comprehension of people who struggle to afford ale for special occasions. Your palace itself stands as a monument to the wealth that flows through church coffers. While peasants in your diocese huddle with their animals in single-room huts, you maintain separate chambers for every conceivable purpose. Your sleeping quarters occupy space equivalent to several peasant homes, while additional rooms serve exclusively for dining, study, prayer, entertainment, and receiving visitors. Each chamber is decorated with tapestries, paintings, and furnishings that represent the finest artistic achievement of the age. The contrast between your living conditions and those of your spiritual flock could hardly be more dramatic. Where they struggle to maintain single candles made from animal fat, your halls blazer with hundreds of pure beeswax candles burning in elaborate chandeliers that cast dancing light across painted ceilings and polished stone floors. Where they drink questionable water from community wells, you enjoy wines and alesh that have been specially prepared and blessed according to traditional formulas. Your daily schedule reflects a life organized around comfort rather than necessity. Morning prayers, conducted in your private chapel, feature a choir of boys whose voices have been preserved through medical interventions that would horrify the families who contributed them to church service. These young singers, selected for their exceptional vocal abilities and trained from early childhood, create musical performances that rival anything heard in royal courts. Administrative duties occupy only a few hours of your afternoon, and even these responsibilities are handled with extraordinary comfort and support. Your scriptorium employs dozens of monks whose lives are devoted to copying religious texts, creating illuminated manuscripts that are themselves works of art. The books produced in your workshops are bound in leather covers decorated with precious metals and gems, containing knowledge that remains inaccessible to all but the wealthiest and most powerful members of society. Your personal library represents accumulated knowledge that surpasses what most monasteries possess. Classical texts by ancient authors sit alongside contemporary works of theology, philosophy, and natural science. Some volumes are so rare that only a handful of copies exist in all of Europe, making your collection invaluable beyond simple monetary calculation. The privilege of reading Latin, Greek, and possibly Arabic grants you access to intellectual traditions that remain completely foreign to the overwhelming majority of your contemporaries. The political influence you wield extends far beyond spiritual matters into realms that affect thousands of lives throughout your diocese and beyond. Your correspondence with kings and nobles shapes policies that determine whether regions experience peace or war, prosperity or famine. Your seal on official documents can authorize executions, approve marriages between ruling families, or grant pardons that literally mean the difference between life and death for those seeking your intervention. Entertainment in your household reflects the cultural sophistication available only to medieval elites. Traveling minstrels compose songs specifically for your court, creating musical works that celebrate your accomplishments and enhance your reputation throughout the network of noble houses. Scholars journey from distant universities to engage in theological debates for your amusement, discussing philosophical questions that ordinary people never encounter. Artists work exclusively on commissions for your private enjoyment, creating paintings, sculptures, and decorative objects that will never be seen by the common people whose labor pays for their creation. Your personal art collection includes not only religious subjects, but also classical themes and even secular works that celebrate earthly rather than spiritual pleasures. The meals served in your dining hall unfold as theatrical productions designed to impress visitors and reinforce your status among the medieval elite. Multiple courses arrive in carefully orchestrated sequences, each dish prepared and presented according to elaborate protocols that transform eating into performance art. Exotic animals, bears, boars, and elaborate game birds are prepared using techniques that require years of training to master. Wine flows freely throughout these extended dining experiences, served in goblets made from precious metals and decorated with gems that catch and reflect the light from hundreds of candles. Entertainment accompanies every course. Acrobats who perform feats of physical prowess, musicians who play complex compositions, storytellers who recite epic tales, and sometimes dancers whose performances would scandalize the very congregations you address from your pulpit on Sunday mornings. The economics underlying your luxurious lifestyle depend entirely on the labor and sacrifice of others. The vast wealth that supports your comfort comes from tithes collected from people who often cannot afford to feed their own families adequately. Church law requires that peasants surrender 10% of their meager harvest to support institutions like your palace, meaning that families already struggling with subsistence must reduce their own consumption to maintain your standard of living. Church lands throughout your diocese are worked by serfs who live in conditions that approach slavery, bound to the soil and forbidden to leave without permission from church authorities. The income generated by their backbreaking labor in fields, vineyards, and workshops flows directly to support the elaborate lifestyle you have created around yourself. Your silk robes and golden chalices are purchased with the sweat and suffering of people who will never experience even modest comfort. When you travel between your various residences or attend church councils in distant cities, the arrangements reflect your elevated status within medieval society. Your personal carriage, lined with furs and cushions, provides comfort that exceeds what royalty enjoyed in earlier centuries. The vehicle itself represents months of skilled craftsmanship, with wheels, springs, and decorative elements that make it both functional and beautiful. A retinue of guards, servants, cooks, and entertainers accompanies your travels, creating a mobile court that can include over 100 people. This traveling household requires its own supply train, with wagons carrying furniture, clothing, books, religious artifacts, and food supplies necessary to maintain your accustomed standard of living regardless of your location. The horses that pull your carriage are bred specifically for comfort rather than speed, selected and trained to provide the smoothest possible ride over medieval roads that would challenge even modern vehicles. Your routes are planned to ensure overnight accommodations in residences worthy of your status, whether your own properties or the palaces of allies who compete to offer appropriate hospitality. Medical care available to you represents the pinnacle of medieval healing arts, creating yet another stark contrast with the treatment available to ordinary people. While peasants rely on folk remedies and prayers to saint for relief from illness, you have access to university-trained physicians who practice the most advanced medical techniques of the age. Your personal doctor studied at prestigious institutions like Salerno or Paris, speaks multiple languages, and has access to rare medicines imported from across the known world. The treatments available to you include sophisticated surgical procedures, carefully prepared pharmaceutical compounds, and therapeutic regimens based on the latest developments in medical understanding. Even your religious duties are performed within a context of extraordinary luxury that transforms spiritual practice into aesthetic experience. Your personal missal, the book containing prayers and readings for daily worship, represents a masterpiece of medieval bookmaking. Bound in leather covers decorated with gold leaf and precious stones, illustrated with miniature paintings that rival the finest artwork of the period, this single volume costs more than most people earn in their entire lifetimes. The chalices you use for communion services are crafted by master goldsmiths whose skills represent generations of accumulated knowledge about working with precious metals. Embedded with jewels and decorated with religious scenes rendered in meticulous detail, these vessels transform the simple ritual of sharing bread and wine into a display of wealth that emphasizes your elevated status within the church hierarchy. Altar cloths, vestments, and other liturgical items continue this pattern of using religious observance as an opportunity to display material wealth. Silk threads, gold embroidery, and pearl decorations transform every aspect of worship into an artistic performance that glorifies not only God, but also the earthly institutions that claim to serve Him. The psychological distance between your daily experience and that of ordinary believers is carefully maintained through elaborate protocols that prevent any real human connection from developing. When you venture among common people, it occurs only as part of ceremonial events designed to emphasize your elevated status rather than create opportunities for genuine interaction. You arrive surrounded by pageantry, mounted guards, religious banners, musical accompaniment, that announces your importance and creates appropriate atmosphere for your appearance. You speak from elevated platforms that physically separate you from your audience, using formal language and ritualized gestures that reinforce the hierarchical nature of your relationship with ordinary believers. Your education and intellectual pursuits create additional barriers between yourself and the people you theoretically serve. Your ability to read Latin, Greek, and possibly Arabic grants access to knowledge traditions that remain completely foreign to illiterate populations who receive religious instruction only through spoken sermons and visual imagery. Correspondence with other intellectuals across Europe involves you in scholarly debates about theology, philosophy, and natural science that ordinary people never encounter. Your mind is cultivated through exposure to ideas and learning opportunities that remain accessible only to a tiny elite whose privileges depend on maintaining their separation from the masses who support them. The fundamental contradiction underlying your entire lifestyle becomes most apparent when contrasted with the religious teachings you proclaim from your golden pulpit. You preach about the spiritual value of poverty while surrounded by material excess that would make ancient Roman emperors envious. You counsel acceptance of suffering while ensuring that you never experience deprivation of any kind. Your sermons emphasize the temporary nature of earthly pleasures while your daily existence demonstrates passionate commitment to acquiring and enjoying precisely such pleasures. You teach that the poor are blessed and will inherit the kingdom of heaven while structuring your life to avoid poverty at all costs and accumulate earthly treasures that directly contradict biblical teachings about wealth and spiritual purity. This contradiction is not accidental or unconscious, but rather represents a systematic approach to maintaining power and privilege within medieval society. By claiming spiritual authority while living in material luxury, you demonstrate that religious rhetoric serves primarily to control ordinary people while exempting the religious elite from the restrictions they impose on others. The daily reality of your existence unfolds within a bubble of privilege so complete that it shields you from any direct experience of the suffering that characterizes life for the overwhelming majority of your contemporaries. You have never been hungry, never been cold, never lacked medical care, never faced the prospect of homelessness or destitution that haunts ordinary families throughout your diocese. This insulation from hardship creates a psychological distance that makes it impossible for you to truly understand or effectively address the problems faced by the people you claim to shepherd. Your knowledge of poverty, illness, and desperation comes entirely from abstract theological study rather than personal experience, making your spiritual guidance largely irrelevant to the practical challenges that define medieval life for common people. Yet this system of extreme inequality is not only tolerated, but celebrated by medieval society, which interprets your wealth and power as evidence of divine favor rather than human exploitation. Your luxurious lifestyle serves as proof that God blesses those who serve him faithfully, while the poverty of your flock demonstrates their need for the spiritual guidance that only you and your fellow church officials can provide. This interpretation allows the stark contradictions of medieval church hierarchy to persist without serious challenge, creating a self-reinforcing system where wealth validates authority while authority justifies wealth. Your daily existence of unimaginable luxury unfolds within a framework of religious legitimacy that transforms exploitation into spiritual service and makes resistance to inequality seem like rebellion against divine order. As evening approaches and your day of privilege draws toward its close, you retire to chambers more comfortable than most people can imagine, surrounded by beauty and luxury that represents the accumulated labor of thousands of people you will never meet. Your final prayers of the day are offered in a private chapel more richly decorated than the parish churches where your spiritual flock gathers for worship, using vessels and vestments that cost more than entire villages produce in years of agricultural labor. This is the daily reality of medieval church hierarchy, a system that concentrated enormous wealth and power in the hands of men who claimed to serve a God of poverty and humility, creating contrasts so extreme they challenge our ability to comprehend how such contradictions could persist for centuries without destroying the very institutions they supposedly served.